Okay, so let's have a look at stem cells. So in the previous video, we talked about the two types of cell division, mitosis and meiosis, and we're going to focus on a special type of cell now, which are called stem cells. So we're going to address three questions. What are stem cells? Where did they come from? And why are they useful? So let's go back a little bit to what we talked about when we talked about fertilization. That's quite important here, really. So when you've got the sperm cell and the egg cell, and they meet, and they fuse, that's called fertilization. And what's formed is a fertilized egg. And basically what happens is, over time, it starts to divide. So one cell becomes 2, and 2 becomes 4, and 4 becomes 8, and 16, and so on and so forth. And in those early days, even those early hours, that forms a ball of cells called an embryo. Now, that embryo effectively is made up of individual stem cells. These are cells that are not specialized. They haven't got a specific job or function yet. They're what's called undifferentiated. Okay? So very early on in the cell's life, they haven't decided, they haven't been told what they are to be. It's a little bit like a lot of students, they don't know what they want to do when they're older, and then they get to a point where they decide, they go and train, and then they become that doctor, that police officer, that nurse, that teacher. Okay? So in school, they might be undifferentiated, but as they get older, they differentiate and they become specialized to do a specific job. Now, stem cells are really, really useful because they have the ability to adapt and change to become lots of different types of cells. So they can be used to treat diabetes, which is a problem with the pancreas. Okay, the pancreatic cells stop producing a hormone called insulin, so the patient can no longer control their own blood sugar levels. So the stem cells can actually regenerate the pancreas. They can be used to treat paralysis, where there's been some form of spinal damage, and the stem cells can become new nervous tissue, which will help to provide some form of repair and mobility in the patient. And it can also be used to treat some forms of cancer. For example, leukemia. Leukemia is a type of blood cancer where the immune system is being affected. And the stem cells can be used to basically create new blood cells so that they can fight off infections, to strengthen the immune system. So these stem cells are really, really useful. There are problems associated with them, we'll come back to in a second, but one of them is the fact that the treatment can be quite expensive at this stage. But as technology improves, as with anything, the cost of that treatment will reduce. Think of your mobile phone. Pretty much everybody has a mobile phone now. Some people have 3 or 4. iPads, laptops, tablets. When they were first released, they're very expensive, and only the rich and the few can afford them. But as the technology improves, the cost of the production reduces, and therefore more people can access that facility. And the same is with stem cells, really. I think a lot of these treatments are for the very, very rich that have private healthcare insurance. But eventually, over time, hopefully these treatments will be available to the general public. Now, the key thing with stem cells is there's 2 types of stem cells. There's those very, very early embryonic stem cells we talked about earlier on from this early embryo. But there's also adult stem cells. So when you grow up, even though you're not an embryo anymore, you still have stem cells in your body, but in a much lower number. Okay? So let's talk about the 2. Now, the embryonic stem cells are probably the most useful because they can differentiate into lots of different forms of cells. So they're taken from the early embryo, so each one of these stem cells here, we can take one of those, and under certain conditions in the lab, they can be forced to form a particular type of cell. So they can differentiate into, say, muscle cells, epithelial cells, red blood cells, nerve cells, white blood cells, depending on how we want to treat that particular patient. Okay? So they're very, very powerful, these embryonic stem cells. The problem with them is the fact that there's a lot of ethical issues surrounding their use. We tend to get them and source them from IVF clinics, in vitro fertilization clinics. These are couples that that struggle to have a child naturally and need a little bit more help and support, where the sperm and the egg are brought together outside of the body, and then the embryo is implanted back into the female then for the pregnancy to occur. Sometimes in those treatments, some of the embryos are not used. Okay, so they can be used for this type of treatment, stem cells, where we can then replicate those stem cells into higher numbers for treatments for other patients. The problem is a lot of the embryos are destroyed. Okay, so a lot of embryos that are destroyed, either through not being used or when we start manipulating, a lot of those cells can die off. So a lot of people have problems with that in terms of, is this embryo alive? This embryo has a potential to grow up into a living life form. The sanctity of life argument comes forward here. It has a right to live. Why should we stop that life to maybe save another? So it's an interesting debate for you to think about. But yeah, there are issues. It's not perfect. The second type of stem cell is the adult stem cell, and these tend to come from adults. And one of the simple locations is the bone marrow. So in the centre of your bones, you have a cavity, and it's formed of an area called the marrow. And this is where a lot of the blood is produced. A lot of blood cells are produced. Difficult procedure, because obviously you've got to try to get to that. So typically you kind of drill in through the muscle tissue into the bone, and then you extract part of the bone marrow. So it's quite a difficult procedure for the person that's actually the donor, that they're donating their stem cells. There are other ways you can get them as well. You can actually take them from a swab of your mouth, but these tend to be in a lot lower numbers. The problem with adult stem cells is they're very limited in what they can actually become. So for example, if you took some bone marrow from an adult, those bone marrow stem cells really can only become blood cells. They're limited because of the location that they were taken from. So it has its limitations and its restrictions. Okay guys, so we've had a quick look there at the stem cells, so hopefully you understand what they are, where they come from, why they're useful, but also some of the issues that surround their use.